5,000 years ago, on a broad plain of mud and shimmering heat, between two unpredictable rivers, something extraordinary began. In the region the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the Sumerians built the first true civilization known to humankind. They did not have forests to fell or mountains to quarry. They had no metal in their soil, no stone for their walls, no horses to draw their carts. Yet from the rich clay of the riverbanks, they built cities that glittered with invention. They turned the most ordinary material underfoot into the substance of progress. The Sumerians were not merely survivors of their harsh environment. They were problem solvers, organizers, and innovators. They developed systems to control the floods that once destroyed their crops. They measured and divided the heavens, the day, and the circle itself. They shaped clay into the first written words and carved their names into bricks that still bear witness to their ambition. In a world still half wild and uncertain, they learned how to shape nature to human need. To modern eyes, the artifacts of Sumer appear almost humble. A wedge of clay pressed with symbols, a bowl baked in the sundae, a plough made of wood. Yet each of these was part of a vast experiment in living together. Out of necessity and imagination, the Sumerians invented tools and systems that made city life possible. They mass-produced goods, organized labor, recorded trade, and built monumental temples to gods who seemed both near and inscrutable. Many of their ideas still shape our days. We measure time in 60 minutes, and the circle in 360 degrees, a reflection of Sumerian mathematics. We build cities from bricks, move goods on wheels, and record our lives with writing. What they began in the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates spread outward in ripples that touched every civilization to come. The story that follows explores 9 of the most influential inventions of ancient Sumer: pottery, writing, hydraulic engineering, the chariot, the plough, textile mills, bricks, metallurgy, and mathematics. Each represents a spark of human ingenuity that lit the path from the Stone Age to the modern world. In their pursuit of order, efficiency, and meaning, the Sumerians showed what it means to be human, to imagine something better, and then to make it real. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. If you enjoy these stories, please take a moment to comment and subscribe. It is the easiest way to support this channel, and it means a lot. Thank you for being here. Now, let us begin. If you were to walk the alleys of Uruk at the end of a long day, when the reed shadows grew and the brick walls gave back the heat, you would hear a steady sound from behind courtyard doors. It was the music of clay, hands slapping wet earth into a mold. A turntable humming as a potter spun a lump into a perfect curve. The crackle of a kiln as reeds and dung lifted the fire to a bright, useful fury. Clay was as common as dust in Sumer, but in those city workshops, it became the backbone of a new way of living. The Sumerians were not simply making pots. They were learning how to make many of the same pot, again and again, each one so uniform that it could sit beside its brothers and pass without remark. That simple achievement bears the unmistakable signature of a society that had discovered scale. The landscape made the choice for them. Southern Mesopotamia had little stone and little wood. The rivers did not give lumber, and the plains held no quarries. What the Sumerians had was mud that dried into a workable clay, a material that would take any shape and remember it. They pressed it into bricks for their houses and their temple terraces. They shaped it into seals for their merchants and tablets for their scribes. But it was the potter who found a way to turn clay into a cheap, reliable container that could be made by the hundreds and then by the thousands. A civilization that aspired to keep grain, to move beer, to count labor, and to feed large groups of workers needed more than beautiful vessels made by patient artisans at the pace of a single life. It needed containers that were good enough, made fast, and made alike. Archaeologists know this story in part through heaps of refuse. Outside the walls of ancient cities, excavators come upon mounds of broken bowls that seem at first glance to be the untidy dump of a careless people. The bowls are thick and undecorated. Their rims are sharply beveled to a simple edge. Most are roughly the size of a pair of cupped hands. These were the ration bowls of Sumer, made to one standard purpose and then thrown away when their purpose was done. They speak of a system, not a whim. In one season of work, a foreman could feed a ditch crew or a temple workforce with measured portions of grain or bread or beer, each serving in its own bowl, each bowl indistinguishable from the last. When the meal was over, the bowls could be set aside or crushed underfoot, and there would be no loss. The next day, more bowls waited in neat stacks in a courtyard kiln. It is important to remember that the first step in this mass production did not require the wheel. The beveled rim bowl was generally pressed by hand into a mold, the clay squeezed outward by the same repetitive motion hundreds of times each day. The result was not elegant, but it was fast. Standard molds and practiced hands created something new in human history, a disposable container made to a civil standard. The potter's wheel entered the story as an accelerant and a transformer. In earlier centuries, a slow-turning platform helped a potter shape a vessel, the artisan nudging the clay, while another person or a foot kept the turntable in motion. By the late 4th millennium, the wheel turned faster and more freely. A skilled worker could pull a pot from a spinning lump in moments, and then another, and another. Forms that had once required a careful hour could be repeated many times in an afternoon. Speed married uniformity, and from that union came an industry. Behind the workshop doors lay an organization that feels familiar to a modern reader. The city temples were not only houses of worship, they were also economic engines with managers, storerooms, and long lists of inventory. Clay was gathered from the margins of canals and soaked in pits until it reached the right consistency. Reed ash and chaff were mixed in to temper it and reduce cracking. Apprentices tramped the clay underfoot, then handed it to more experienced workers who weighed out lumps by habit. Some pressed molds and lifted out the bowls. Others worked the wheels, pulling up graceful jars for water and oil, tall storage vessels for grain, wide-mouthed pots for brewing. In a far corner, a foreman tended the fire of the kiln, feeding it with reeds cut from the marsh and with dried dung that burned hot and steady. There was little romance in this work, but there was a craft discipline that grew in power with each repeated motion. The benefits of mass-produced pottery touch every part of Sumerian life. A city of tens of thousands needs a way to store and move staples. Grain spoils if it sits in damp heaps. Beer must ferment in tightly managed vessels. Water must be carried from canal and river to courtyard and roof. Without reliable containers, the scale of life collapses. The Sumerians created an answer that was cheap, light, and comprehensible to every hand that touched it. For long-term storage, they lined large jars with bitumen and sealed them with clay stoppers, impressed by a cylinder seal that recorded ownership or origin. For daily use, they made the small and medium vessels that appear in household debris everywhere excavators dig. The sheer number of such finds, and the narrow range of their shapes, tell us that the pottery of Sumer was a standard language of utility. You could look at a rim and know what it held and how it would pour. The beveled rim bowl was not the only sign of a new economy, but it was the most democratic one. Fine painted wares and delicate cups still appeared on elite tables, and imported luxury vessels could be admired in palace storerooms. Yet the work bowl was the most common touch of the system on a laborer's day. It delivered a ration for the crew dredging a canal as surely as it held offerings at a temple gate. Its very crudeness was an advantage. It cost almost nothing. It asked little of the user and less of the treasurer, who had to reckon how many would be needed for a season of work. In that way, the bowl did not simply carry food. It carried an idea of equitable measure that could be counted and audited. In the growth of the Sumerian administrative state, that mattered as much as any stone foundation. There is a further ripple that reaches outward. Once a society knows how to make 1,000 of the same thing, it begins to see how to make other things in number. The potter's wheel taught a lesson about repeatable motion and controlled result that echoed in the textile rooms where spinners counted twists and weavers counted picks, and in the brickyards where molds turned out endless blocks for city walls. Standard containers also changed trade. A merchant loading a boat at a quay in Lagash needed to know that the jars he shipped would fit tightly and survive the journey. Standard forms stack against one another and can be bound in reed mats for stability. That brings order to a boat's hold and allows longer journeys down the canals and along the river into the Gulf, where Sumerian goods moved toward distant markets and foreign goods returned to Sumerian quays. Pottery also carried the marks of identity and control. Stoppers and jar handles often bear seal impressions that name an institution or an official. Those seals were rolled across the clay before it was dry, leaving scenes of worship or hunting and inscriptions that named a household or a temple. A sealed stopper could show that a jar of grain had been issued by a certain storehouse, or that an oil jar belonged to a specific cult precinct. In a world without paper or metal locks, wet clay recorded the chain of custody. When a scribe broke a seal in a storeroom, the act became visible and accountable. Here, pottery and writing stood side by side, one carrying the goods and the other carrying the information about the goods. The clay tablet and the clay jar were cousins in a practical family. The technology itself evolved in intelligent ways. Early kilns were simple updraft structures, pit-like chambers with a grated floor and a domed cover pierced by vents. The fire burned below, and the hot air rose through the ware, drawing oxygen and flame along a path that could be adjusted by opening or closing small vents with clay plugs. A kiln tender learned by practice when a firing had reached the point where a jar's ring was true, or when the bowl's body had passed from fragile green clay to a durable ceramic. Fuel mattered, and the Sumerians made a virtue of necessity by using what the marshlands offered. Reeds dried in the sun and dung patties shaped and stacked like small wheels made a fire that was predictable and strong. In the long view, one can see an ecological story as well as a technological one. Pottery allowed cities to rise without cutting forests and without quarrying distant stone. It was the green technology of its time, a way to use a renewable local resource that could be recycled at the end of its life into fill for a wall or temper for a new batch of clay. The potter's wheel deserves its own moment on the stage because it introduced something more than speed. It introduced symmetry as a measure of quality and beauty that could be achieved by process rather than by rare talent. When a wheel turns, the clay obeys a discipline set by motion itself. A good potter reads the body of the clay with fingertips and palm. A small change of pressure at the right instant pulls a wall thin and true. In Sumer, the wheel created a family of forms that became the vocabulary of the household and the storehouse. Short-necked jars for water, tall amphora like jars for oil and date syrup, wide bowls for mixing doughs and brews, narrow beakers for drinking. The shapes repeat with only small variations from city to city. When those shapes are found in distant lands, they tell us something about where the vessel was made and how far it traveled. In this way, pottery is also a historian. It keeps the minutes of trade and migration long after the scribes have fallen silent. The social meaning of mass-produced pottery is equally striking. In earlier village life, a pot might be the work of a household made by a woman who learned from her mother. In the temple city, that same woman might work in a supervised group where quotas were recorded and rations were paid in measured wool and grain. Specialization grew, and with it a division of labor that allowed some people to become very good at a narrow task. The potter who mastered the wheel was valuable, but so was the worker who kept the kiln at the right heat and the one who prepared the clay to a repeatable standard. The product of their hands entered a system where administrators counted vessels, recorded distributions, and inspected for quality. The bowl might be simple, but behind it stood a new human arrangement that supported crowding, cooperation, and authority on a scale unknown in earlier ages. There are flashes of beauty here as well. Not every Sumerian pot was plain. Fine wares with burnished surfaces and subtle painted bands appear in graves and in the upper rooms of palaces. A jug with a perfectly round belly and a rising neck speaks of a potter who had an eye for grace. Even in a system dedicated to quantity, trained hands could achieve elegance, and the wheel could serve art as well as utility. It is the balance of the two that defines Sumer. The city needed the cheap bowl that could be discarded without regret. It also prized the graceful cup that could be held up during a feast. Both came from the same material and often from the same quarter of town. When we speak of mass production in Sumer, we are really speaking of a new rhythm to ordinary life. The day begins with water fetched in a jar whose belly holds a known measure. Bread is mixed in a wide bowl whose width and depth are known by feel. Beer ferments in a vessel whose porous walls breathe at a rate the brewer understands. A mason carries mortar in a bowl that can be lifted by one man without strain. A ration clerk fills a stack of small bowls to a fixed line and lets them cool. Each act is guided by a vessel whose form is standardized, and those forms teach people to expect sameness where sameness is helpful. In time, that expectation shapes more than pottery. It shapes the thinking that makes a ledger and a schedule and a plan. There is an irony to this story that is worth noting. The very bowls that signaled the triumph of scale are the least valued of all Sumerian artifacts. They lie in heaps and shards, common as gravel. Yet they teach as much as any carved stone about what it means to build a city from the earth. A ration bowl says that someone planned a workforce, that someone measured a portion, that someone stood at the head of a line and handed out the day's share. A storage jar stamped with a seal says that someone accepted responsibility for what it contained, and someone else stood ready to check their honesty. A simple cup found in a house yard says that a family lived by the same reliable shapes as their neighbors, and that their trust in those shapes freed their minds for other concerns. In the end, what the Sumerians accomplished with clay is a model for how human beings turn constraint into advantage. They had no marble, so they learned how to burn clay until it rang and how to shape it into 1,000 useful forms. They had no forests, so they found fuel in the marsh and learned to tune a kiln until it matched the need of the ware inside. They did not encourage genius to work in splendid isolation. They taught many hands to do a few things well and then set those hands to work together. Out of that patience came the tangible foundation of urban life. A city that can feed workers with measured rations and equip households with affordable vessels is a city that can lift its eyes to other tasks. It can dig canals, raise temple terraces, record its business on tablets, and mount a defense on chariot wheels. At the center of that progress sits a courtyard where clay is kneaded and bowls are fired, and the steady music of useful work never quite falls silent. At the margin of the river one evening in Uruk, when the fields had been watered and the barges nosed home to their quays, a young man sat cross-legged with a damp tablet on his knee. The clay held the heat of the day and gave off the faint scent of silt. In his right hand he held a reed cut to a triangular nib. His left steadied the tablet as his wrist made a practiced rhythm of press and lift. He was a scribe in training, and what he was doing would alter the future more profoundly than any wall or canal. He was learning how to make speech stand still. Writing did not begin as an art. It began as a remedy for forgetfulness and a tool for trust. In a city where hundreds of laborers drew rations and hundreds of jars arrived at the storerooms each week, memory could not serve as the only ledger. Clay could. The earliest texts that archaeologists have found in the levels of Uruk and Jemdet Nasser are not prayers or poetry. They are lists, numbers, and commodities. The accounting of a society that had grown too large to run on personal recollection. Barley in so many measures, wool in so many bundles, beer in so many jars. At first, the signs were pictures drawn with a pointed tool. A jar looked like a small oval. A sheep looked like a stick-figure animal. A head counted as a man. The system was direct and utilitarian, and it worked. The moment was astonishing all the same. Human beings had discovered that marks pressed in clay could carry meaning across space and time, and that an institution could be managed by a record rather than by a story repeated at the gate. Behind those first marks lay an older habit. For centuries before the first tablets, people in Mesopotamia had kept track of goods with small clay tokens. A cone might stand for a measure of grain. A sphere might stand for a flock animal. A lozenge might stand for a jar of oil. The tokens were sealed in a clay envelope that was then marked on the surface with impressions of the shapes inside. When the envelope was broken in the presence of both parties, the contents confirmed the count. It was a clever device, half contract and half calculator. Sometime late in the 4th millennium, merchants and officials realized that the surface impressions alone could carry the meaning without the bulk of the tokens themselves. A lump of clay became a page. The token system yielded to tablets with impressed signs and numbers. In that shift from object to sign lies the birth of abstraction. It is the same step a child takes when she understands that a drawing of a tree can stand for a tree, and then that a mark can stand for a word, and then that a sign can stand for a sound. The transition from pictures to a full script was gradual and practical. Administrators needed to record names, not just things. They needed to write verbs for giving and receiving and owing. They needed adjectives for types and quality. They discovered that a sign could be used not only for what it pictured, but also for a syllable it sounded like. A sign for a reed could be used for the sound of the word reed in a different context where no reed was meant. This phonetic use released the system from the limits of its pictures. With that discovery, the scribes began to build a repertoire of signs that could be combined in many ways. The stylus itself changed as well. Instead of dragging a point to draw a picture, the scribe pressed the cut reed into the clay to leave a wedge-shaped trace. The new technique was faster and cleaner. A trained hand could produce line after line of signs in the time it would take a novice to draw a single picture. Thus was born cuneiform, the wedge writing that would cover tablets from Sumer to Syria for 2,000 years. Writing immediately altered the texture of urban life. The act of issuing a ration became a transaction with a record. The sealing of a storeroom became a procedure with witnesses and a written memorandum. Land transfers, loans, and marriage contracts could be set down and stored. Trust changed character. It no longer depended entirely on the reputation of the parties and the memory of the neighbors. It could be anchored to a document kept in a temple archive where any dispute might summon it back into the light. That change favored institutions. It also protected ordinary people who were not powerful enough to win an argument at the gate without evidence. A barley debt recorded by a scribe was a matter even a chief had to respect. The clay itself made an excellent archive. In a dry climate, a tablet will harden and last for centuries. Even when tablets were meant to be temporary, some survived because of accident. A storeroom fire would bake a stack of documents so thoroughly that they would outlive the building that housed them. In the rubble of ancient cities, archaeologists find deposits of tablets lying where a wooden shelf once stood. The topmost are fused into an unbreakable brick. The lower tablets can be pried apart with patience, and their writing comes back to life with each flake of dust that is brushed away. From such deposits, we know not only what was counted and promised, but how people thought about their world. Uruk was the great incubator of this transformation, but it was not alone. Tablets appear across southern Mesopotamia as the 3rd millennium begins. The signs in each city vary slightly, in the way that dialects differ from valley to valley, but the same spirit of system invites comparison. Early tablets are almost entirely administrative. Then come lexical lists where teachers had students copy columns of words grouped by category: fish, birds, stones, trees. The method tells us that scribal training was already formal by the time the lists were made. It also tells us that writing had begun to serve the mind as well as the storehouse. To make a list is to impose order. To copy it is to learn that order and to imagine what else might be arranged that way. The school where such lists were copied was a place of strict discipline and high ambition. The Sumerians called it the tablet house. Later texts preserve a vivid picture of its regimen. A student rose before dawn, carried his clay and his stylus, and sat in a crowded room under the eye of the school father. He copied signs until his hand ached. He chanted lines of proverbs and model contracts. He learned to draw up receipts, to set down dates and personal names, to compute totals for lists that filled the page. He studied laws and letters and hymns. He learned formats, since writing is as much form as content. The beating that a lazy student might receive was part of the memory of those who graduated to the profession. So was the pride that came with the title of scribe. In a world that had recently left behind the village, the ability to write opened doors to a career that was not bounded by a field or a family craft. Writing also had a powerful effect on language. Spoken Sumerian is lost to us except for what the signs suggest, yet the very effort to match speech to a script encouraged standardization. Names acquired preferred spellings. Common phrases developed conventional sign sequences. The habit of writing encouraged a habit of clarity and fixed terms. The process was never uniform. Change and variance persisted. But the presence of an external reference that could be consulted at need brought a measure of stability to a culture that was expanding across its floodplain. Cylinder seals form a quiet companion to this revolution. These small carved stones were rolled across wet clay to leave a band of images and signs. A seal stood as a personal signature, as well as a badge of office. Beautiful and practical, they joined the visual with the verbal. A seal might show a worshipper led by a god toward an altar, while the inscription names the owner and his role. When rolled across a jar stopper or a tablet edge, the seal made a transaction both official and aesthetic. It is not too much to say that the Sumerians took pleasure in making bureaucracy beautiful. The meeting of images and words in a seal is also a reminder that writing did not replace other forms of expression. It added another layer of meaning to a culture already rich with ritual and art. From the start, writing proved elastic. It could register numbers, but it could also carry myth. Once a sign held a sound as well as a thing, the way opened to literature. There is a story told in Sumer of a king who needed to send a message to a distant land. The tale says that at the moment of need, he summoned the skill that made words live in clay. Whether the legend reflects invention or simply celebrates it, the point is clear. The Sumerians knew writing as a solution to the problems of distance and time, and they also knew it as a new way to imagine. Hymns to the gods that had once been spoken only in precincts could now be copied and carried. Laments for cities ruined by war could be preserved as lessons and as comfort. Proverbs could be gathered into collections that shaped the morals of the young. The first legal decisions could be recorded and cited. The kings of Lagash and Umma left inscriptions that argued for their rights with the certainty that a carved text would outlast a human breath. Metrology and mathematics flourished alongside the script. To write a number is to commit to a measure. The Sumerians organized capacity in nested units. A small measure of grain made a larger measure. A certain number of those made a still larger one. We see in their tablets the careful tally of jars and baskets and the translation from one scale to another. We see the sexagesimal spirit appear early as a way of grouping and dividing. The tablet and the numerical system grew up together, each making the other more useful. A scribe had to master both to do his work. He knew how to count workers for the week and how to assign their portions without error. He also knew how to reckon the surface of a field when a boundary had shifted or a canal had been cut across a corner. The clay carried his steps as surely as a surveyor's chain in later centuries. The archives of the temples and palaces reveal the astonishing reach of writing once it's settled in. There are dispatches that report on the training of draft animals and the state of the canals. There are letters sent from provincial governors describing disputes and requesting supplies. There are inventories of tools, from bronze picks to reed baskets, each counted and inspected. There are lists of singers and musicians attached to a cult, with rations of beer and bread assigned for a feast day. There are contracts of apprenticeship and the manumission of slaves. There are receipts for payments in silver or in wool. There are court records with the names of litigants and witnesses and the decision of the judge. The paperless office of Sumer was a marvel of the ancient world. It ran on mud and reeds and sweat and the unglamorous genius of forms. We must not miss the intellectual revolution concealed in this routine. To write is to classify and to abstract. It is to hold in the mind a sign that stands for something else, and to combine signs according to rules that have no physical presence. Once a society can do that, it can teach with a power unknown before. It can make lists and tables and models. It can transmit techniques with a precision that does not depend on the fragile chain of demonstration from master to apprentice. A brewer can learn a recipe from a tablet. A builder can learn the measures of a foundation. A farmer can learn the schedule of irrigation from a manual. Each new tablet is a chance to remove one uncertainty from the work of daily life. At the same time, writing captured the voice of conscience and memory. The Sumerians were not immune to defeat. City walls fell. Fields went untended in years of turmoil. In the aftermath of war, poets and priests composed laments that named the gods and begged for forgiveness. The laments were written and kept. They changed how later generations remembered those events. Writing, therefore, made history in a second sense. It did not just record what happened, it shaped what would be remembered as having happened. It fixed names and dates, however loosely at first, and gave future scribes the raw material for chronicles. It is tempting to draw too direct a line from those early tablets to later literature, yet the family resemblance is present. The tales that would become the great epic of Gilgamesh were first recited in Sumerian and later written down in Akkadian by successors who inherited both the myths and the medium. The habit of putting traditional stories into fixed forms began with the same tablets that taught students how to compute wages. The tools of bureaucracy opened a path for the tools of imagination. A society that had learned to control water and make bricks now learned to capture thoughts so they could cross generations. The spread of cuneiform beyond Sumer tells its own story. Neighboring peoples adopted the script for their own tongues, adding and adjusting signs as needed. Akkadian became the diplomatic language of a region, carried on clay to palaces far beyond the river plains. The same wedge marks that once counted sheep in Uruk would one day carry a letter from a ruler on the Nile to a king in the Levant. That is the reach of a good idea when it is backed by steady practice and by institutions that keep it alive. The Sumerians gave the world a technology of memory. Their descendants extended its range. The work of the scribe was not an abstraction. It was a posture and a callus, a narrow reed cut from the marsh, a tablet pulled from a basket and smoothed with a wet palm, a sign begun with a firm push of the stylus and finished with a quick twist. The scribe learned how long to leave the tablet in the shade so it would not crack. He learned when to bake a record to make it permanent and when to leave it soft because it would be needed only for a short time. He learned the etiquette of witnesses and the phrasing of acknowledgements. He learned how to hold his status among officials with sharper elbows. He learned, perhaps most of all, that the power to write confers an obligation not to confuse. A clear tablet makes a clear day. It is worth pausing on one classroom tablet found at Shurapak. It contains a series of proverbs and instructions to a young man. They counsel honesty in weights and measures. They advise respect for parents and caution in taverns. They warn against bearing false witness. The maxims are practical and moral at once, and their presence on a student tablet suggests that the tablet house taught more than penmanship. It taught a civic ideal. The written word became a mirror in which the society looked at itself and said what it hoped to be. That is one of the most powerful gifts writing gives. It allows a community to set standards and to remind itself of them long after the heat of the moment has passed. In the end, the invention of writing in Sumer is a story about turning clay into a second mind for a city. The first mind is the conversation at the gate and the shout in the field and the bargain at the quay. The second is the tablet that keeps the echo of that conversation long enough for someone on the far side of town, or the far side of a season, to answer. The two minds together made possible a society that could act in a coordinated way across space and time. Without writing, the scale of Sumer would have collapsed under the weight of its own complexity. With writing, the city could grow, could combine the efforts of thousands, could discipline its energies, and could remember what it had done. When we touch those old tablets through museum glass, we are looking at the earliest evidence that thought can be made durable. The wedge marks are small. The clay is ordinary, yet the leap they represent is as large as any in the human record. From that invention comes the ledger, the law, the letter, the hymn, the lament, the story, and the map. The Sumerians discovered how to fix words in earth, and by doing so they allowed later peoples to speak across centuries. Hydraulic engineering. Before the plough cut its first furrow, and before the stylus pressed its first wedge into clay, the people of Sumer learned to read the language of water. Their country was a paradox. It was a flat and treeless land where rain seldom fell, yet two great rivers flowed through it with moods that ranged from generous to murderous. The Tigris ran fast and often violent. The Euphrates wandered like a serpent across its floodplain, shifting beds and smothering fields that had been dry the year before. In the late winter and spring, meltwater from the far mountains swelled both rivers at once. A season of ease could become a season of ruin in a single night if a levee failed. It is here, under a sky that gave little rain and beside rivers that gave both silt and fear, that the Sumerians fashioned one of the first and most consequential systems of environmental control. They made a garden out of a capricious plain. They did it with spades and baskets and with a patient habit of planning that would outlast dynasties. The first lesson was the simplest. Water had to be guided. From very early in the 4th millennium, families and neighborhoods scratched small feeder ditches from the banks to their plots and learned that even a short channel could change a harvest. What began as local tinkering grew into a landscape enterprise. Villages joined their efforts to cut broader canals that ran parallel to the main rivers, and then branched into secondary and tertiary channels like the veins of a leaf. At intervals, they built earthen dikes along the river margins to hold back sudden rises, and they set low embankments beside canals to keep precious water from spilling away. Where the ground fell too slightly to encourage flow, they opened siphons through banks or cut new beds that took advantage of every faint gradient. In a country where stone was scarce, they used clay and woven reeds for everything. A gate could be a stout frame of tamarisk branches packed with mud and sealed with bitumen. A weir could be a bundle of reeds anchored with palm trunks, its crest raised or lowered by adding or removing bundles in an afternoon. The work required more than muscle. It demanded calendars and mutual obligations. Canal banks, slumped and silt gathered in quiet reaches. Without constant dredging, a channel that ran clear one year would choke the next. City leaders and temple councils learned to summon labor when the water fell and the beds were exposed. Men and women with baskets and mattocks moved in lines, lifting silt to the banks where it could be tamped into new levees. Teams with sleds moved cut reeds to reinforce weak places. The city that failed to keep to this rhythm suffered for its laziness. A broken levee in the late spring could send brown water across ripe barley and drown a season's work. The neighbors would not forget who neglected a bank or who stole water by making a secret cut, and they would not forgive easily. A landscape made by cooperation taught, just as stubbornly, the cost of betrayal. The scale of irrigation changed the economy and the demography at once. A field watered by a controlled flow yields more and yields predictably. In Sumer, that meant barley above all. Since barley tolerates salt better than wheat, and the soils, season by season, carried a growing burden of salt left by evaporating water. With canals, a few households could tend a larger acreage than rainfall alone would permit. Surplus grain supported craftsmen and scribes and soldiers and priests. It fed dock workers who loaded barges with wool and reeds. It paid for bronze imported from far uplands and for lapis drawn from remote mines. Irrigation did not merely add water to soil. It added certainty to life, and certainty is the first requirement of city planning. You can only promise rations to a workforce if you can measure what the fields will give. The fields can only be measured if the water obeys you. Archaeologists tracing old beds across the alluvium can see how this obedience was won and how often it was renegotiated. The Euphrates left old scars in crescents and cutoffs that run like ghost rivers under the modern soil. Early Sumerian cities such as Uruk and Ur stand near former banks, a reminder that the lifeline of a city was not a fixed line, but a moving one. When the river migrated, a canal might become the main artery, and an old bed might turn into a lagoon or marsh. The Sumerians responded with new cuts and connecting channels. They reshaped their map repeatedly, always with the same humble tools, always with the same sober recognition that rivers do not care about the plans of men. That patience is part of the character of their civilization. They did not bend the rivers to a single straight will. They learned a choreography that allowed water to pass with the least harm and the most help. The human cost and organization behind this were immense. The annual maintenance of the waterworks was likely the single greatest recurring public project of the Sumerian city. A canal inspector and his staff measured heights and slopes with cords and rods. Foremen set teams to dredge, and others to pack and repair. Scribal clerks kept lists of crews and recorded who showed up and who found reasons to be gone when the summons came. Penalties for neglect appear later in law, codes that echo older habits. They say plainly that if a man failed to shore up his section of bank and a flood escaped through that breach, he owed grain to his neighbors for their loss. The principle is ancient. When the plain is a single garden, a hole in one wall endangers all the beds. Responsibility could be traced, and so could blame. The religious life of Sumer carried the same lessons in a language of reverence. The god of fresh water and wisdom, who the Sumerians called Enki, is often shown with streams flowing from his shoulders, populated by fish, and spreading over the land. The image is comforting and precise. Water is both gift and knowledge. It is to be welcomed, and it is to be managed. Rituals at the rising and falling of the rivers tied civic duty to divine order. The temple did not only pray for the flood to come right, it also owned the granaries that held the barley seed and the records that assigned workers to the banks at the proper time. A pious city was also a well-maintained one. One can see the civilizing effects of irrigation most clearly in the contested lands between city-states. The fertile strip called the Gwedena, the Good Plain, lay between Lagash and Umma. The boundary there was not a mountain ridge. It was a line of canals and fields to which both sides laid claim. The Stele of Vultures, which commemorates a victory of Lagash under its ruler Eonatum, speaks of boundary stones and ditches set by ancient decree. Whatever the exaggerations in the text, the picture is credible. Water, which made the wealth of the land possible, also made exact limits a matter of irrigation math. Where a channel began and ended, and who had rights to divert or to draw first, were not abstractions. They were the difference between a fat harvest and a lean one. The conflicts are among the earliest known political quarrels in human records, and they are on the subject of water as much as they are on pride. There were engineering refinements within this broad system that speak to the Sumerians' practical genius. Levees were not simply heaps of mud. They were built in layers of clay mixed with chaff for tensile strength, and then faced in places with laid brick bound with bitumen. At canal intakes, where the force of the river might scour a bank to a ruin, they lined the bed with clay pavers, or drove palisades of brushwood to break the current. Sluice gates were installed where a parent canal fed its children. The gates sized to deliver a known flow given a known head of water. These gates could be lifted or lowered by a pair of laborers using ropes and pegs. In flood time, the same gates could be raised to relieve pressure, and spill channels could be opened to direct excess water into marshes instead of into tilled fields. If a breach opened, the first responders were men with reed mats and baskets of clay who could stitch a wound long enough to bring heavier work to the site. The rhythm of the year, which had once been the simple alternation of sowing and reaping, gained new chapters in an irrigated land. There was a season for scouring silt. There was a season for cutting reeds at their prime for use as binding. There was a season for checking and mending the many small works that together made the difference between a good year and a disaster. The calendar was written in the water. A headman knew by the level of a canal pool whether he could promise a certain amount of water to a field next week. A scribe who kept the allotment table learned the weight of water as carefully as he learned the weight of barley. We should speak of the dark side, because the Sumerians had to face it. Every drop of water carries salt to the surface and leaves it behind when the sun drinks the flood. Over decades, the salts accumulate in the soil and choke crops that once grew easily. The people of the south learned to rotate parcels and to rinse fields in the rare seasons when floodwater was abundant enough to allow a scouring flow. They learned to leave certain beds to rest and to plant salt-tolerant crops like barley instead of wheat. In some regions, salinization slowly pushed the center of gravity northward over centuries, a long rebalancing that can be traced in the pattern of settlements and in the changing composition of crop records. The lesson is sobering. To command nature is not the same as to master it. Every solution alters the terms of the next problem. The Sumerians became, perhaps for the first time in history, managers of a down payment they would hand to the future, with both gains and liens attached. Irrigation also linked city and countryside in an intimate dependence. An upstream cut to take water for one district could leave a downstream district with muddy trickles when clear flow was most needed. Agreements about turn-taking and levels appear in later texts, and they surely existed earlier as spoken customs and written notes that have not survived. The city that wanted peace needed to balance its own hunger with its neighbors' rights. The instrument of that balance was a chart of channels and a schedule of openings. The scribe at his desk was as important to this peace as the ditcher in his trench. Between them lay a social contract as muddy and real as the water itself. No small part of the Sumerian achievement lies in their honesty about the fragility of their work. They understood that even a well-kept canal system is a creature of constant care. Drought could wither the master stream. A curious change in the path of the Euphrates could abandon an intake completely, forcing a city to cut a new feeder across marsh and old field. The leadership that prospered in this landscape knew that triumph was provisional. They held periodic survey campaigns where measuring cords were stretched and stakes reset. They kept men on retainer to watch banks and to walk the lines after a storm, or after the quick squalls that passed from the Gulf in late summer. They did not make a promise about next year's water without first sending someone to walk the ditch. The gifts of hydraulic engineering were not limited to food. Water carried goods. A barge loaded with woolen cloth or stacks of bricks could travel farther and cheaper by canal than any caravan could manage overland. The Sumerians straightened reaches, cleared snags, and set together a navigable network that tied city to city like beads on a cord. At the height of a good season, the canals would show a parade of flat-bottomed boats pulled by men with long reeds, their cargoes covered with mats, their wakes trailing patterns in the brown water. This traffic moved news as surely as it moved goods. A rumor of conflict could travel with a trader to the next city in an afternoon. A request for help could travel with a courier in a day. Irrigation created a geography of attention as much as a geography of wheat and barley. What makes the Sumerian water system so moving is not that it was perfect, but that it was human. It was measured with cords, not with lasers. It was raised by hands and baskets, not by engines. It was managed by men and women whose pride in a straight channel and a clean bed shines through the ages in the simple fact that they kept at it. They made law out of the need to be fair, and they made ritual out of the need to be humble. They built a city in the open and named the river both friend and rival. Later, powers would build grander works in stone and engineer massive embankments from mountains to sea. The Sumerians deserve a different kind of honor. They invented the very habit of looking at a landscape and asking what it would take to keep it alive. In the evening, a visitor to one of those canal banks might have watched a last crew finish tamping a repaired section while the water rose almost imperceptibly on the upstream side of a gate. The foreman would give a nod. Two men would lift the gate by hand, and a muted roar would announce the return of the flow. The channel filled with a speed that always surprises those who work with water. Ripples set against the new clay. Fish nosed into the current. In the fields, a farmer who had waited by his small intake would see the shine come over the lip and spread in a slow sheet. Tomorrow he would walk the ridges with a staff and let the water into each bed in turn. For now he would watch, a quiet figure against the last light, and know that this year, at least, the river and the city were partners. The chariot. On a shell and bitumen mosaic buried with the dead in royal Ur, a procession of men advances in two registers like the beats of a drum. In one register there is feasting and musicians, a calm face of abundance. In the other there is movement and noise. Four-wheeled carts rumble over fallen enemies, while drivers lean forward with taut reins, and the long ears of the animals strain against the yoke. The image has the clarity of a statement. Here is power that moves. Here is a platform on wheels that converts muscle into momentum, and momentum into fear. The Sumerians had taken the oldest village discovery, the round thing that turns, and married it to animals trained to pull, and put on it a crew with weapons in hand. In that marriage we can hear the first distant clatter of mobile war. The path to that moment is older than the mosaic. Sumer knew the wheel long before the war cart, the same turning that made pots quickly and truly encouraged the idea of a disc that could roll a load across a yard. Heavy solid wheels of planks joined together appear early, mounted on axles that turned inside slots carved into a wooden frame. A sledge that had long skidded over the ground now rolled. A stone that would have taken a team to drag could be moved by fewer hands with a cylinder beneath it. In a land of mud and reeds, where the ground turned to glue with rain and baked to packed crust with sun, the wheel found work first within cities and their edges. It ran on brick ramps and tamped courtyards, and then, by extension, along causeways and packed canal banks. There were animals to pull, though not the ones that later ages would harness to victory. The horse, as we imagine it, did not yet stride the Sumerian plain. Instead, there were onagers, the powerful wild asses of the steppe, and there were donkeys, patient and sturdy, and there were hybrids bred by skillful keepers that carried the vigor of the wild and the tractability of the tame. These hybrids, later called kungas, were costly and prized. They were tall enough to pull a heavy frame, spirited enough to charge, and trainable enough to accept the contrivances of harness and rein. Tablets speak of studs and handlers and the careful accounting of animals by age and quality. A city that could organize water and grain could also organize breeding and training with the same administrative precision. The earliest vehicles suited to combat were not the elegant two-wheeled chariots of later kingdoms. They were heavy carts with 4 solid wheels that slammed the ground with every rotation. The frame was stout and high-sided, a box of wood and rawhide where a driver could stand braced against the jolt, and a warrior beside him could throw javelins or brandish an axe. Such a cart needed 4 animals abreast for strength and stability. The yoke was a crossbeam lashed to the necks. Reins ran back to a bit or noseband for control. The driver pulled the team into a trot and then into a thudding canter. The sound alone would shake a line of men who had never faced a wall of moving wood and muscle. Those carts on the mosaic are not romantic inventions. They are plausible to the bolt and strap, and they look as if they could do precisely what the image shows. Out of this blunt instrument came refinements. Craftsmen lightened the frame with better joinery and more skilled use of hide thongs that added spring to the platform. Wheels came to be made of 3 or 4 spokes of heavy plank fashioned into a cross and bound within a rim, still solid but less massive than a full disc. Bearings were greased with animal fat and bitumen, and axles were shaped more true. A driver learned to shift his weight with the movement of the team and to keep his animals together by touch and voice. The warrior beside him learned how to throw from a moving base and how to judge distance while the ground ran under him. They learned how to turn together, how to break off a run without tangling the yoke, and how to wheel around a flank and strike again. There was nothing automatic about this craft. It was learned in open fields with bruises and broken axles, and the stubbornness that grows when men decide that a difficult thing is also a useful thing, and therefore must be mastered. The question of where such a vehicle could be used was answered by the landscape. The south was cut by canals and softened by marsh. The best ground for wheels lay on the margins of levees and on the packed flats beyond the fields. The north and the west presented more open expanses, where hard ground and seasonal grasslands gave the advantage to speed. What began in the cities of the lower plains found wider use as the idea traveled with soldiers and merchants. Wherever there was an expanse of firm soil, a vehicle that brought men together in motion could change the balance of a fight. Even before horses were common, a team of trained asses or hybrids could outrun a man and deliver a shock. That shock was not just physical. It was the sudden appearance of a moving platform that combined the presence of a wall with the mobility of a charge. The uses of the early chariot were varied. In battle, a handful of carts could break the poise of a line and create the small failures that spread panic. Their height offered a vantage point from which a commander could signal and see. Their mass offered cover to the spearmen, who stepped down to finish a fallen enemy or to shield a standard. Their speed allowed a quick thrust to a weak point and a swift retreat before infantry could close. In the hunt, the same vehicle allowed a team to run down wild game on the open steppe. In ceremony, a ruler standing in a car behind a team projected command and order, the reins in his hands a visible metaphor for control over unpredictable forces. Seals and plaques delight in that image. The king upright and composed while the animals strain. The wheels a perfect circle under his feet. None of this would have been possible without advances that seem unremarkable on a workbench but matter in the field. The yoke had to distribute the pull across the shoulders without choking the animals. Leather had to be cut and softened so that straps did not gall. Bits had to be shaped so that a command from the hand could become a clear pressure on the mouth. Wheels had to be pinned to axles that neither seized nor slipped. Each innovation came from trial and correction. A teamster who lost a cart to a broken dowel learned to carry spares. A driver who saw his team panic at a sudden shadow learned to speak and pat the neck until the animals trusted his voice more than their first fear. A commander who used his carts to pursue too far learned that a wheel mired in soft ground is a death sentence. In this way, a literature of practice grew up in the memories of crews and camp followers, long before anyone set it into words. The presence of these vehicles altered logistics as well. A cart could carry a chest of weapons or a pile of spare spears. It could carry water skins and tools. It could transport an injured nobleman quickly enough to save him when a stretcher crew would have failed. It demanded fodder for its team and the attention of a groom, and thus it tied a fighting force to a tail of support that had to be fed and managed. The very fact that a cart could move faster than men on foot created new tasks for runners and mounted messengers, who had to keep commands and reports flowing between a mobile element and the main body. The small ecology of the cart thus stretched outward into a broader ecology of camp and road. There is a temptation to think of the early chariot only as a weapon that ushered in an age of brutality. It did that, in part, as every improvement in the art of war has done. Yet it also brought a set of habits that belong to the discipline of technology itself. The makers of carts had to measure with consistency and work with templates. They had to bore holes true and shape axles to the same diameter each time. They had to understand the relation between weight and strength and learn how to place braces where stress would be greatest. A vehicle that bounced itself apart at a rut was not worth bringing to a muster. The carpenters and leatherworkers who served a palace stables lived inside that calculus and passed it on to apprentices who would one day adapt it to other crafts. The animal at the yoke stands at the center of the story. The Sumerians and their neighbors were not sentimental about their beasts, but they were intimately dependent on them. The training of a team began with halter and lead. The novice learned to walk beside a man without shying and to accept the feel of a strap across the chest. He learned to begin at a word and to halt at another. He learned to step near another animal without anxiety, and finally to move in harness, where the chafing noise of wood and leather and the presence of a pole at his side might have spooked him early on. The trainer learned to watch for soreness and for signs of willful balking, to distinguish fear from stubbornness and pain from laziness. The quiet knowledge in those stables filled the gaps where written instruction was not yet present. A city that could keep a fleet of carts ready to move had built itself a school in every stall. The symbol of the moving car took hold in the imagination. Rulers were shown riding in peace with parasols held above them, their faces set forward in a calm that denied the bump and rattle beneath their feet. On battle scenes carved into stone reliefs centuries later, the vehicle became lighter and swifter, its wheels given spokes that seemed to slice the air, its team now horses that lifted their forelegs high as if flying. The Sumerian car stands at the beginning of this line. It is the first clear sign that someone thought to make a platform for men to stand upon while moving faster than any man could run. That idea would travel. It would change its materials and its scale and its uses, but it would remain the same in its essence. A human being's desire not just to move, but to move with a plan. The critics of early chariotry within a city might have had arguments of their own. A cart consumes resources. It demands pasture and grooms. It requires roads, or at least clear ways, kept free of obstructions. It tempts a ruler to believe he can solve a dispute with speed and display rather than by talk. The supporters could answer that a cart can move a load as well as a warrior, that it can help police a wide territory, that it can carry a sick child from a farm to a healer in half the time, that it can draw a plow in a pinch when oxen are scarce. Between these positions is the ordinary truth that a new technology rarely has a single moral. It carries both benefit and risk, and the people who adopt it must learn to balance them. Sumerian terrain-shaped chariot tactics. A field may look flat to an eye that travels on foot, but a driver learns to read it differently. He looks for the shine that means standing water just under a crust. He looks for the faint ridges left by a farmer that will jolt a team at speed and throw a warrior off balance. He looks for the firm tops of dikes and the risky softness at their toes. He calculates turns with a sense of where the wheels will slide on dry dust and where they will grip. He learns the geometry of pursuit, how to cut a curve short without asking too much of his animals, how to approach a line of men so that his companion can throw at the right moment without the jolt of a rut. When a crew performs these calculations well, their cart looks inevitable. When they perform them poorly, it looks like a trap made of wood. The spread of the chariot idea across the Near East cannot be separated from the spread of taste and status. A prince who saw a visiting envoy arrive in a handsome car would want one like it. A marriage that joined two houses might bring a team and a cart as part of the dowry. Workshops learned new tricks from foreign craftsmen held in a palace retinue. A trading mission might bring back a novel bit or a new pattern of wheel, and the palm-sized pattern would be studied by men who knew immediately where it could improve their own practice. In this way, the chariot became an early carrier of design thought, a moving gallery of solutions to shared problems. The artistic record is not a simple mirror, but it offers a sequence we can trust in broad strokes. From heavy four-wheeled cars, there is a progression to two-wheeled platforms that are lighter and quicker. From solid wheels, there is a progression to wheels with spokes that allow a larger diameter without an impossible weight. From teams of asses and hybrids, there is a progression to horses, whose speed and stamina change the equation of the battlefield. This later development would alter empires and turn plains into arenas where chariot squadrons danced and fought. The Sumerian contribution sits at the head of the stream. It provided the first proof that the earth itself could be part of a weapon, that the firm ground could be harnessed like a blade, that a man could be carried into battle standing upright, with a force behind him larger than his own weight and faster than his own stride. In ceremony, the chariot had a gentler face. It made a stage on which to display order. In a city where success depended on coordinating many hands, there was a special satisfaction in watching a team move in step and a driver hold the whole with an economy of gesture. Processions allowed the citizens to see their ruler as a figure who could tame motion and make it serve. This was not a small thing in a culture where floods and winds could make mockery of human plans. The image of a man steady on a moving platform carried the suggestion that change could be mastered and that the city could ride events rather than be thrown by them. If we return to the mosaic in Ur, we can now read more in its hard-shell glint. The craftsman who set the figures into bitumen understood that they were telling a story about a new kind of presence. This was not the club or the spear or the wall. This was a form of organization expressed in wood and leather and bone and animal sinew. It required breeding and training, carpentry and metalwork, rationing and repair, practice and courage. It was the tip of a spear whose shaft was the entire city. To field a handful of carts, a ruler had to have men who could count, men who could plan, men who could persuade, and men who could learn. The chariot therefore becomes a sign not only of force but of administration. We are a long way from those trundling carts when we think of modern vehicles that move with a whisper over paved roads and shoulder aside the air with bodies shaped in wind tunnels. Yet the continuity is there. The wish to stand above the ground and let a made thing carry us farther and faster is old. As old as the city on the plain and the reed-filled rivers that cut it. The first carts were awkward, but they changed the balance of power, and they changed what a person could expect to do in a day. They taught lessons about materials and maintenance, about training and tactics, about the intimate connection between a machine and the landscape under it. They made it possible to imagine a state that could arrive quickly and be gone before an adversary gathered his breath. At dusk, on an open stretch beyond a canal, a team might be walked out and turned toward a line of low hills. The driver would check the yoke and the pins and run a hand down each flank. The warrior would heft his bundle of javelins and count them by habit. A groom would unloop the reins from the rail and step back. At a word, the team would lean, the wheels would begin to clack, and then the rhythm would rise to a rattle that echoed off the water. The cart would gather speed, the driver would fix his eye on a point ahead, and the man beside him would feel the frame under his feet and judge his throw. It would be a sight that scattered shepherd boys and drew them back at once. It would be the sound of a new chapter in what people could do together when they trusted wood and leather and the intelligence of animals and the steadiness of their own hands. The plough. Morning on the plain came not with birdsong from trees, but with the small noises of people already at work. A boy tapped the side of a clay jar to see whether the water within had held its cool through the night. A woman dusted flour from her hands and reached for a bundle of reeds by the door. In the open field beyond the levee, a man stood with a length of wood that curved downward to a blade the color of old earth. 2 oxen shifted their weight and blew steam into the chill air. He lifted the haft and set the blade against the ground. The oxen leaned and the blade bit, and the first furrow of the day opened like a narrow river that would guide seed to a safe place. The moment was simple and steady, and it is possible to say that little else in the story of Sumer mattered more. Before the plough, a field was a stubborn opponent. A digging stick could break a crust in patches, and a hoe could chop small squares into the topsoil. But the work was slow, and the result uneven. Seed scattered on such ground might sprout where fortune placed it, but much of it would burn or wash away. The Sumerians had already learned to bring water to their fields and to drain it away when the flood came too high. What they needed next was a tool that could prepare the earth to welcome that water and hold that seed in a line where growth could be tended. The answer was a wooden ard, a simple plough that did not turn the soil, but parted it and crumbled it along a guided path. When coupled to the strength of oxen, it changed the scale of what one family could manage. A pair of animals with a trained hand behind them could open row after row from morning until dusk in the time it once took to square a small corner of ground. The earliest ploughs were nothing more than heavy beams whose lower end had been sharpened and shod with a tip of hard wood. The addition of a metal shoe came later, as copper and bronze became common in the toolkit of the farmer. The geometry was everything. The share had to meet the soil at a shallow angle so that it split rather than stalled. The beam had to be braced to a yoke with cords that would not slip or stretch. The handle had to give the plowman a way to feel the bite and lift the point when a stone hidden in the alluvium threatened to halt the team and snap the wood. With each season, craftsmen tuned the angles and reinforced the joints where stress gathered. Over time, the plow was no longer a single piece of timber, but an assembly of parts that could be repaired and replaced as needed. An art that had learned many fields through many hands became a household heirloom, its polished surfaces bearing the marks of calloused palms and its scars patched with clever pegs. The partnership with animals gave the tool its true power. Oxen had the slow endurance that the work demanded. They could lean their weight into a yoke and walk a field in straight lines if the driver kept his voice low and his hand steady on the goad. Yokes themselves changed shape as farmers learned to spread the load across the shoulders rather than press against the neck. A bad yoke wastes strength and rubs sores that will turn an animal mean. A good one becomes a piece of harness that turns muscle into a calm and lasting pull. The farmer, who knew each ox by name and mood, was a manager as well as a plowman. He read the signs of fatigue and of stubbornness. He altered the pace and the length of the furrow when the air grew heavy and the sun climbed the sky. In the cool seasons, he lengthened his reach, and in the heat, he spared his team the worst hours. Knowledge of animals sat beside knowledge of soil in the farmer's mind, and both were as practical and tested as any principle taught in a temple school. With the art came a second invention that belongs among the quiet genius of Sumer. The seeder plow joined a seed funnel to the body of the plow, so that as the share opened the earth, a measured stream of seed fell into the cleft, and the soil crumbled back upon it. The result was a single pass that cut and planted at once. The gain in time and consistency is hard to exaggerate. To scatter seed by hand is to fight wind and impatience. To lay it into a furrow as the furrow is made is to fix it where water will find it and birds will not. A craftsperson who could bore a straight channel through wood and seat a clay or copper tube at the right height gave a farmer the capacity to multiply his day without rushing his judgment. When the team needed a spell, a boy could block the funnel with a plug and the plow could travel to the next line without wasting grain. Such details show in the small finds of archaeologists and in the echoes of later drawings. And they speak of a people who refused to be casual with effort. The plow changed more than the field. It changed the map of work and the meaning of time. Before, sowing was a sequence of tasks that could be interrupted by weather or by the demands of a household. With the plow and the seeder, sowing became a campaign. A family set out with a plan to cover a certain number of rows before the light collapsed. A neighbor might come with his team to help finish a parcel so that water could be taken at the appointed hour when the canal tender lifted the gate. Work began before the sun cleared the horizon and settled only when the animals had been watered and the two lids of the seed funnel were closed. The rhythm was both martial and devotional, and in it can be heard the drumbeat of an economy that understood coordination as the path to plenty. The Sumerians not only built tools, they wrote down what they had learned about using them. Clay tablets from early in the 3rd millennium preserve practical instructions for farming as plainly as they record rations and debts. In the lines of those tablets, the reader hears an old voice that is both teacher and friend. Scatter seed when the soil shows this color and texture. Do not cut an intake to the ditch on a day when the river stands high. Keep your oxen free of sores and never let the share go dull. Offer a prayer when the first shoots break the surface, and keep a watch for field mice that steal at dawn. This mingling of advice and piety is more than charm. It is the recognition that agriculture is both a science of observation and a practice of hope. Nothing shows more clearly that Sumer had become a society that transmitted skill with intent. A father taught a son in the field, and a tablet set a baseline for the boy who would apprentice beyond his own family. A farmer who worked with a plow became a surveyor. Straight lines mattered for irrigation and for the health of the crop. A crooked furrow steals water from its neighbor and leaves sections dry. The plowman learned to set his eye on a distant marker and walk as if a cord pulled him forward. He learned to count his paces and judge the evenness of his work by the way the light caught the rippled soil. He learned to judge the field by its soil, tasting a pinch between his teeth to see if it held too much salt or crumbled too readily to dust. He learned the grammar of the plain as fully as a scribe learned the grammar of the tablet. The marks of his knowledge faded sooner, but they were no less rigorous. In this marriage of tool and attention lies the enduring nobility of the work. The plough made possible a surplus that fed cities and paid for soldiers, musicians, and stonemasons. An acre opened by oxen and ard yields more in a season than an acre scratched by hoe. When thousands of acres are shaped in rows that align with the feeds and drains cut by the canal crews, the returns multiply. Granaries filled with barley, and their managers learned to seal jars and mark accounts that would even out the bad years. Trade grew because there was grain to export in exchange for timber and metal from lands that had those gifts. A city is not simply a crowd that gathers. It is a concentration of tasks that stand at a remove from the soil. The plough underwrote that distance. The more regular the field, the more daring the projects in the city. A tower of mud brick faced with fired brick rises not from rhetoric but from the quiet confidence that the fields will bring forth as promised. Critics might say that the plough chained people more tightly to the land than ever before. There is truth in that. The moment a city promises rations to a workforce, the fields beyond the walls become an obligation rather than a choice. A failure to plough a parcel in time will not merely leave one household hungry. It will ripple through the temple kitchens and the palace wages and the markets that expect a flow of flour and beer. The plough created a level of accountability that made idleness a civic fault and made incompetence a public danger. The Sumerians answered this pressure with a set of habits that reveal a shrewd tenderness. They rotated fields where the salts rose. They shared teams when a neighbor fell ill. They scheduled the use of water so that upstream and downstream could both live. They wrote penalties into local custom for the man who shirked his duty to mend a break or clean a feeder. A people that could engineer its landscape could also engineer a culture that balanced burden and benefit. The craft of the plough cut across the social register. High officials owned estates and counted their acres in tablets filed in archives. But the work of opening the earth still happened at a pace set by animals and the endurance of one man with a handle in his palm. There was dignity in that work that found its way even into the art and song of the time. Banquet scenes show the fruits of that labor in loaves piled on low tables and jars of beer gathered in circles that invite friends to lift a cup. In the temples, grain offerings are presented in tall baskets, woven to a standard size, a measure as clear to a priest as to a clerk. The plough thus touches both the sacred and the everyday. It produces the bread that feeds gods and men in different ways. And it teaches a shared language of portions that runs from house to house like an invisible thread. There were years when the sky withheld mercy, and the canals ran low, and the earth hardened beneath the point. In such times, the ploughman knew that his tool could do only so much. He shortened his furrow and set his team to work where the soil still held some moisture. He watched the horizon for a haze that meant change in the winds, and he rose in the night to walk the banks for signs that a tender had opened a gate upstream. Work in those years was an act of endurance that bordered on defiance. The ard would thump against ground that rang like fired clay, and still he would try again at the edge of the field where the shadow had lingered longest. In other years, the flood rose high and spread cold fingers over beds that could drown in a night. Then the plough became a tool of repair. It broke a new line to carry water to a drain, and a new line beyond to give seed a chance on higher ground. The same instrument that made the harvest possible made survival possible when the seasons turned unkind. If you look closely at the way a ploughman walks behind his team, you will see a concentration that has little to do with romance and everything to do with stewardship. He is reading the immediate future at the point where wood meets earth. He is listening to the breath of the oxen and the rasp of the share. He is adjusting the depth with a twist of the wrist that comes from muscles trained by years. He is choosing to lift and reset rather than to force, because a forced cut splinters both tool and hope. That discipline is the same discipline that held Sumer together across generations of risk and quarrel. It is the slow genius of a people who found in repetition not boredom but mastery. The story of the plough is also the story of children who walked the field edges and learned by watching. A boy carried a water jar and pretended with a stick to guide an invisible team. A girl crouched in a furrow and pressed a grain into the crumble and covered it with her fingers. The knowledge went into their hands before it went into their heads. Later they would see a tablet in a school and read a proverb that told them never to drink from the field stream before they had given their oxen their fill. They would smile because the wisdom was already in their bodies. In this way, a society seeded its future as carefully as it seeded its fields. It did so with patience and with the plain assumption that tomorrow would ask the same questions as today. When we imagine the great inventions of Sumer, we see walls and canals and wheels, and rightly so. The plough belongs in that company as the quiet equal of the others. It is a lever that turns animal strength into a geometry of food. It teaches order and rewards attention. It binds neighbors to one another because water and time are shared risks. It gives a city the courage to build and a household the courage to raise children in the faith that the earth will answer work with yield. If the potter's wheel gave Sumer containers and the stylus gave it memory, the plough gave it bread that never came by accident. Textile mills. At first light in Lagash, long before the market stalls clattered open and the scribes took their places in the tablet house, a different city stirred behind thick walls. Courtyards that by afternoon would smell of bread and boiled dates filled with the faint powdery scent of carded wool. The soft knock of spindle whirls against a weaver's palm made a quiet music. Women bent over piles of fleece, teased from the backs of sheep that grazed in the damp meadows beyond the levees. They drew out fibers to a thin, even line and fed that line to a spindle that turned with a practiced twist of the fingers. The twist went into the fiber and held there, and a strand of yarn grew from a cloud of wool as if by spell. This was no household idyll. It was industry before the word had a factory attached to it. The Sumerians had learned how to gather skilled hands under one authority and make cloth in quantities that could dress a city and pay for the wood and metal the plain could not give. Textiles had always belonged to the house. A girl learned to spin while watching her mother and aunts. A narrow loom could be set in the shade of a wall, and a length of linen woven during a season of good gossip. The change came when the great institutions of the Sumerian city began to count outputs instead of admiring handiwork. Temples and palaces took herds on their ledgers and assigned pastures. They noted the shearing and weighed the wool in baskets that the clerks could lift and judge as if they were weighing grain. From those measures, a planner could calculate how many garments a season might yield and how many workers would be needed to turn fleece into cloth before the next shearing. The place where those workers gathered began to look less like a household and more like a mill. The word did not exist then, but the thing did. It was a courtyard complex with storerooms for bale and yarn, working sheds along 3 walls, water jars in every corner, and a small office where an overseer kept lists with a stylus that never cooled. Wool was the material of choice. It grew near at hand and it suited the climate and the culture. A sheep belongs to a landscape of canals and low pasture and can be managed in great numbers by boys who learn their animals young. When the spring shearing was done, the heavy fleece came away in clumps and strips. Women who had carded wool since childhood knew how to separate staples and mix fibers from different animals to create a uniform feed for the spinners. Nothing was wasted. Coarse fibers became warp, and finer fibers became weft. The best was reserved for garments for those who stood at the front in ceremonies or who wore office. A bolt of wool from a temple shop might pass through many hands and leave a record at each table. The wool was issued in a measured weight to spinners who returned yarn in the ratio expected by the overseer. The yarn was issued again to weavers by the length and strength required. Finished cloth returned to the storeroom tied in rolls and sealed with clay tags, impressed by a seal that named the institution and sometimes the forewoman of the room where it was made. The loom in Sumer was usually a standing frame of 2 beams set vertical and 2 beams set horizontal, with the warp stretched between the uprights like a harp. A woman stood at the loom and lifted leashes to separate the warp into sheds. She threw the weft through the gap and beat it home with a sword-like beater polished by years of use. The cloth grew downward from the upper beam, and the weaver watched the tension of the threads with the same alertness a ploughman brought to his furrow. There were other forms. Narrow strap looms could be rigged for specialty bands and fringes. Felters could make thick mats by heat and pressure alone. But the large vertical loom ruled the shop because it could take long warps and produce lengths of plain weave good for tunics, mantles, blankets, and trade cloth. The rhythm of that work set the rhythm of the day. A strong weaver might finish a strip several cubits long by dusk, her hands and forearms telling her when to rest before a mistake forced her to unpick a line. What made these workshops more than a collection of looms was the system wrapped around them. Rations in barley and beer were issued to workers at the start of each month, and sometimes at the end as a bonus for exceeding a quota. Children too young to weave full-time twisted strands for cordage and carried water. Older girls spun continuously, their spindles turning while they walked, and while they Saturday, the overseer recorded the output of each team, and often the output of each worker. There were punishments for theft and for careless work that failed inspection. There were incentives for those who hit the standard and helped others to meet it. The tablets that preserve these details are as dry as any ledger, yet they give us our first clear glimpse of a managed production line where specialization and supervision made goods in volume. This was the economic heart of the temple as much as the precinct lined with altars. Piety and payroll shared a wall. Color and finish mattered, and here too Sumer showed both pragmatism and flair. White and natural brown wool formed the base of most cloth, but dyers used plant infusions to produce reds from madder and warm yellows from saffron-like blooms and certain barks. Browns could be deepened with tannin-rich woods. Simple blue shades appeared in later periods where trade carried dye plants from distant gardens, though the bright coastal blues that would one day make merchants rich belonged to other shores. A bolt of cloth might be patterned on the loom by alternating bands of different yarns, or by setting up a warp that created subtle stripes when viewed in the sunday. Finishing workshops beat the cloth with smooth stones while it was damp to make it full and tight. Fuller-like processes used clay and ash to scour oils from the fibers and make the surface even. There is nothing romantic in this stage. It smells of wet wool and alkali and strong effort. It adds value all the same. A well-finished mantle drapes differently on a shoulder than a hastily woven sheet. Elites understood the difference, and so did the men and women who made the cloth that common folk wore to market and to field. Textiles quickly became a currency of trade. Sumer had little to cut and mine. It needed timber for roofs and for boats and copper for tools. The plain gave wool by the cartload. It gave cloth by the bolt. Merchants loaded canal boats with rolls wrapped in reed mats and poled them along the network that connected city to city and then out through the river mouth to the Gulf. There they met men from Dilmun and Magan and beyond, who brought copper from mountains and hardwood from lands far from the silt. Cloth could be counted and measured and offered as payment in a way that pleased both sides. It did not rot quickly if kept dry. It could be reissued to soldiers and laborers, or sold again in markets up the coast. The roll of textile thus became a unit, not unlike a jar of oil or a basket of grain. It had weight and value, and a seal impression on its tie that said whose hands had shaped it. The social shape of these mills deserves attention. The workshops were overwhelmingly staffed by women, many of them consigned to the institution for terms measured by years rather than days. Some came by debt arrangement, some as part of agreements that tied households to temple service, and some likely found the work steadier than the uncertainties of a smaller household economy. The record is honest about hardship. Quotas could be high and rations low in lean years. The day began early and finished when daylight failed and hands ached. Yet the record also shows pride. 4 women are named. Skilled spinners whose output exceeded the measure receive extra grain. A weaver whose cloth passes inspection with praise may be granted a public blessing during a festival. The hearth that warmed the workshop on cool mornings was a place for stories and for strategies about how to coax a stubborn warp to behave. In those rooms, one can hear a collective intelligence that finds solutions and shares them without writing them down. Tools traveled with the workers even within the compound. Each spinner had her preferred whirl, carved from stone or baked clay, heavy for coarse yarn and light for fine. Each weaver kept a bundle of heddle sticks smoothed by her own hand. The loom frames themselves were communal property, but the small implements that make up a craft lay closer to the person, touched and tuned until they felt like extensions of the fingers that used them. The overseer knew that tools lost or mishandled hurt output and morale. A good room had a small chest where spares were kept, and a woman in charge who could fix a broken heddle string and smooth a nick in a beater without losing an hour to fault finding. The presence of a central textile industry changed the way the countryside worked. Temple estates held flocks not as decorative signs of wealth, but as engines for the mills. Shepherds counted their animals at night, as carefully as scribes counted bolts by day. Routine and attention gave both enterprises their yields. The timing of lambing, the selection of rams, the annual plan for the best shearers to visit each fold, all fed the supply line that brought wool to the city. The mills in turn sent out finished cloth as rations to workers on canal crews and to porters and to soldiers. A man who dug silt from a bank and lifted it in a basket worked in a garment that was part of a chain of organization stretching from lamb to loom to ledger. The cloth he wore was not a private product of his own house. It was a sign that he belonged to a city that could clothe him, so he could work for the city again tomorrow. Textiles also created new professions around the edges. There were tailors who cut and stitched with bronze needles so that rectangular lengths could become close-fitting tunics or fringed mantles fit for a singer or a courtier. There were cleaners who specialized in removing oil and dirt from garments without destroying the cloth. There were brokers whose job was to move surplus cloth to markets where it would bring the best return in silver or in wood. There were warehouse keepers who learned to stack bolts so that air could move among them and damp could not gather and spoil an entire wall in a week. There were clerks in small rooms whose tables filled with labels and stoppers as they tied and sealed and wrote out the particulars of each roll. The mills multiplied labor rather than replacing it. They made room for intelligence of many kinds, from the flick of a wrist that yields a perfect twist to the exact look in the eye that knows a shop needs more water jars before noon. There is an often repeated observation that innovations in one craft spread to others because they share certain requirements. Textile mills required standard measures and predictable processes. That habit of standardization served the brick yards, where molds produced consistent blocks, and it served the potteries, where shapes became uniform for stacking and for shipment. The mills also required managers who could think in terms of flow and bottlenecks. Where is the work slowing today? Is the slowest room carding or is it finishing? Do we have too much coarse yarn that cannot be used on the fine looms this week? The mind that asks such questions learns to look at a city the same way. Where is the canal system backing up? Which gate needs attention first? Which crew can be redirected? In a quiet way, the discipline of cloth taught a larger discipline of administration that kept Sumerian life from dissolving into a mass of good intentions and missed appointments. Objects carry stories and textiles carry them eagerly. In tombs of the great, traces of fine cloth appear as ghost patterns in tarnish on metal or as impressions in the dust that once held threads. Artists carved scenes of ritual where fringed garments swirl as musicians turn and dancers lift their arms. The long tassels that decorate royal skirts boast of hours at a loom as surely as a seal boasts of an office won. Common life left fewer images, but many more fibers in the soil that lay beneath courtyards and streets. Those fibers, when scientists lift them and set them under a lens, show twist directions and counts per finger width that can be compared across sites and years. Even now, the mills are whispering about their methods in a language of thread that stubbornly endures. There is a moral dimension to this industry that recurs in later civilizations. Centralized production gives a state power to act quickly and at scale, whether to clothe an army or to weather a bad harvest by distributing garments in exchange for labor. It also creates a temptation to press the vulnerable too hard. The Sumerians managed both truths. The temple as employer could be exacting. It could also be paternal. Rations were a right as well as a reward, and there is evidence of allowances for childbirth, and for sickness, and for old age in the wording of some later texts. We should not sentimentalize this. The day was long and the work relentless. At the same time, we should not miss the seeds of something recognizably civic, a sense that a collective enterprise implicates the whole city in the well-being of its parts. The mills connected Sumer to worlds far beyond the horizon of the flat plain. Boats carrying bales of cloth made for harbors where the water turned salty and the air smelled of bitumen and brine. From there, merchant captains followed the coast past islands and capes, to trading partners whose names filled the mouths of storytellers in evening courtyards. Those partners sent back copper from ores in mountains Sumerians would never see, and hardwood timbers long enough to bridge a courtyard or span a boat. Cloth was the ticket to those goods. It stood in for a currency that did not yet exist in coin. It wrapped the city in a network of obligations and gifts. If a ship went down in a storm, a city felt the loss not only in the loss of cloth, but in the interruption of the cycle that brought tools and planks back up the river. That is how essential the mills had become. If one steps back to look at the whole, the textile industry in Sumer begins to resemble a portrait of the civilization itself. It is ordinary and extraordinary at once. It uses the patient skills of many to produce something broadly useful. It depends on water and on animals and on human hands that refuse to become careless. It makes beauty in passing even as it serves necessity, because a bolt of plain cloth can please the eye as well as a painted vase if it falls in a line that flatters a shoulder or keeps a child warm in a winter wind out of the north. It offers work that can be taught and learned and measured. And in moments of crisis when cities quarreled or weather failed, it provided a means to shore up order by promising that needs could be met from a store that existed because people had planned together. As the light fades in the workshop courtyard, the day begins to put itself away. The spindles are laid in baskets with their whorls carefully wrapped so that a nick will not spoil tomorrow's twist. The looms are covered with cloths to keep dust from the threads. Finished bolts are counted and tied with cords and sealed. The overseer lifts the clay tags and turns them to dry on a tray. Women wash their hands in a basin and rub oil into fingers that have carried rough wool all day. There is talk of a brother who has returned from canal work and of a child who stood for the first time. There is a small joke about a foreman who cannot count to save his life. The gate closes, and the courtyard remembers the hum that filled it since dawn. Outside, musicians begin to tune for a feast, and the smell of stewed lamb moves down the lane. The mills have done their share to make such evenings possible, quietly and without flourish. Mass-produced bricks. At sunrise in Uruk, the ground was already warm. Men and boys moved in a line from the clay pits to the workyard, each carrying a basket of wet earth that had the smooth feel of river silt and the gritty bite of chopped straw. The foreman knelt beside a wooden frame set on tamped earth and pressed the mixture with both palms, quick and sure, then lifted the frame so that a perfect block held its shape in the light. He set it on its edge with a practiced flick of the wrist so the breeze would take the moisture evenly from all sides. Beside him, a second line turned yesterday's bricks so the bottom could dry today. Beyond them, rows marched away into the distance like a regiment at attention, thousands of plump rectangles waiting for the sun to finish what hands had begun. In that sight lay the secret of Sumer. The cities were not quarried from mountains. They were grown from mud in gardens of brick. Southern Mesopotamia offered little timber and less stone. The people of the plain turned to what they had in endless supply. Clay settled by the gift of the rivers, straw from barley fields, water from canals, and the human patience to repeat a simple task until a wall rose that could hold back time for a generation. The early builders learned to mix chaff with the clay so that fibers ran through the mass, binding it the way roots bind a bank after a flood. They learned the right consistency with their fingers. No measure needed beyond the memory of how the mixture should pull and how it should shine before it dulled on the surface. They learned to oil the mold with a wipe of water before a fresh charge so the bricks slid free with clean edges. They learned to lift on the breath, not on a random count, so that teams could move together without breaking rhythm. These are the small arts that rarely make it into poems, but that write themselves in the skyline of a city. Sun-dried bricks served almost every purpose. Stacked in running bond with joints sealed by more mud, they rose into house walls that kept cool air in by day and let night breezes carry heat away by dark. They formed the courtyards where families pounded grain and carded wool. They lined the drains that ran under lanes and connected kitchens to the canals. Their limitations were known and managed. A sudden storm could eat at a wall if the surface was not protected and the top carried no coping. The makers answered with a skim of clay-rich plaster renewed each season and with eaves that threw a strip of shade down the wall. The city as a whole answered with a habit of constant care. In the cool of the morning, someone always seemed to be smearing a fresh coat on a corner or tamping a loose course on a parapet. The pride lay not in permanence, but in resilience. For certain works, sun alone did not suffice. The Sumerians baked brick when the need was great and the budget of fuel allowed. A palace gateway that would bear a heavy lintel, a canal lock that took the pressure of a winter flood, a temple stair that saw thousands of sandaled feet each month. These called for bricks that rang when struck and refused to soften even when the sky poured. The firing kilns were simple in plan and exacting in practice. A clamp kiln could be built by stacking bricks in a hollow vault with flues that ran like secret corridors. Reeds and dry dung fed the fire from below, and the heat climbed through the stack, changing clay into ceramic, with a chemistry that a good kiln tender knew by eye and by the pitch of a knock. Kilns were placed where there was room to draw air and space to let the stack cool slowly, so that new bricks would not crack from a shock of breeze. Fired bricks were expensive in fuel and time. They were reserved for where they mattered most, then faced on the outside with careful joints filled with bitumen where water pressed, and with clay mortar where dryness could be expected. The substance that bound the fired brick in wet work was as much a Sumerian specialty as the brick itself. Bitumen bubbled up from seeps in the earth in black pools that smelled of oil and salt. Men skimmed the tar and strained it through reed baskets. Heated gently and thinned with oils, it flowed into joints and formed a waterproof bond that made canal linings and quay walls possible. A mason who knew his business could spread a ribbon of warm bitumen with a flat wooden trowel and seat a brick before the ribbon skinned, tapping the course until lines were true and the ooze at the seam promised a tight hold against a winter freshet. A city that knew where its bitumen came from held a trump card in the long management of water and of time. The standardization of brick turned the work from art into system. Sizes varied from city to city and from period to period, but within a project the measure was consistent. One common size in the late 3rd millennium gave a brick that lay easily in the hand and could be moved by a boy as well as a man without strain. Some dynasties favored square bricks for temple platforms and rectangular bricks for walls. The point was predictability. A wall course could be counted in advance. A ramp could be estimated by the load. A platform could be planned to finish on an even bond at the step. In this way, architecture gained a grammar. Builders did not reinvent the sentence every time they set a wall. They spoke in familiar units and expected each phrase to match the next. Stamped bricks tell a story in their own voice. Kings impressed their names and their claims into the clay before it hardened. A brick lifted from a ruin may bear the inscription of Ur-Nama or Shulgi of Ur or a ruler of Lagash. The stamp is brief and proud. It states that this king restored the wall or raised the temple. It makes the very material of the city a record of office and obligation. The stamp served practical ends as well. It marked a batch as the work of a certain yard. It discouraged theft from civic stores. It allowed inspectors to trace a failure back to its source and a success to its makers. In a deeper way, it is an early act of public authorship. The city spoke through the brick, and the brick spoke for the city. Foundations were an art of their own in a land where the ground could be treacherous. The Sumerians learned to float heavy works on layers of reed mat laid in alternating courses with mud. The mats spread the load and kept the first courses from sinking into the soft, wet soil. In places where water stood near the surface, workers dug to firmer ground and tamped the bottom with layers of gravelly clay before laying the reed raft. Along canals and in low places, they used palm trunks set as piles to grip through layers of mud. The sequence was simple to say and hard to do well. Lay reed, lay mud, lay reed, lay mud, until a platform as springy and strong as a woven basket spread under the first brick. A temple terrace rose not from one foundation, but from 100 thin ones, married together under pressure. The skill of that marriage is the reason some Sumerian platforms still rise as flattened mounds from the plain where their outer faces have long since fallen away. The ziggurat began as a raised terrace and became a mountain built of brick. Successive rulers added levels, each faced with fired bricks set in bitumen, each level filled with sun-dried bricks laid in courses and bonded by mud. The interior was not a hollow showpiece. It was mass upon mass in a careful geometry that carried weight down and out without crushing itself. Workers laid rows that leaned slightly inward so that the whole resisted spreading. Drainage channels carried rain down through the core. Stairways were not merely grand avenues for processions. They were practical structures that tied the faces into the body and gave the brickwork a skeleton. From the top, a priest could look across 100 courtyards and fields to the horizon. From the base, a laborer could say that he had set his hands to the raw material of a mountain and made it stand. In this way, the city created a sacred height in a flat land. And it did so with the same tool it used to make a garden wall. City walls tell the same tale in another register. The poet says to walk upon the walls of Uruk and examine the brickwork. Excavators who have traced buried lines find courses of mud brick many feet thick and towers set at intervals where fired brick faced the gates. The walls were not designed against catapults or engines that had not yet been imagined. They were designed against ladders and fire and the slow work of water. Their parapets were broad enough for patrols to pass one another. Their bases were sloped to shed rain and to deflect the first rush of a flood. When a section failed after a season of storms, masons and laborers took it down and rebuilt with the same molds that made the first courses. The wall was a living project, not a monument sealed at a dedication. Bricks lined canals where the banks needed a hard face. They paved quays where boats unloaded jars and bales. They formed the frames of ovens that burned hot enough to bake bread for feasts and bricks for other ovens. They made the vaults over drains that ran under lanes. They stood beside doors in the form of pilasters that thickened a wall at a jam. They were the everyday solution to almost every problem of form. When a family needed to enlarge a house for a new child or a married son, they took down a section of wall and laid a new line by noon. When a storage room needed to be cool and dry, they gave it double walls with an air gap. When a courtyard needed shade, they laid arcades of short spans that carried reed mats and let breezes enter. The ark was modest and built by many hands, a logic of brick, not of quarried stone. The city grew by rearranging its own units. Fuel was always the limiting factor. The plane could not support the constant firing of every brick. Reeds grew in enormous stands, but they also fed people and animals and served as roof thatch and basketry. Dung from cattle and donkeys burned well, but it also fertilized fields. The Sumerians spent their fired brick budget wisely. Kilns were lit for facings and for structures in contact with standing water. Sun-dried bricks made up the bulk of all else. In dry climate and with constant attention, the choice was sound. We moderns see erosion and think failure. The Sumerians saw maintenance and thought order. A wall that receives a new skin each year keeps its strength and its place. A city that trains itself to that rhythm keeps its life. Organization held the entire enterprise together. A brickyard had its own small bureaucracy. Clay gatherers were assigned pits and schedules so that the supply never stopped. Mixers measured straw by baskets to keep consistency. Mold men were chosen for speed and clean edges. Turners watched the weather and decided which courses needed shifting in the afternoon air. Kiln men were a breed of their own, scarce and prized, for a sense of heat that could not be taught quickly. Cart drivers moved stacks to sites and brought back broken bricks to be recycled into new mixes. Scribes kept tallies that allowed a master builder to know when to call for a new batch and when to shift crews from mixing to laying. We read their marks and see the dry bones of management. Their contemporaries felt the lively bones of a city that could raise a new courtyard in a week and an entire temple terrace in a season between floods. There were failures. A newly laid wall might bulge when a foundation course softened in an unexpected seep. A kiln might crack a stack if a gust turned the flame too fast through a channel. Bitumen might run in a summer swelter and stain a facade that had been laid with pride. Sumerian builders met faults with a practical courage that deserves respect across millennia. They shored, they rebuilt, they revised designs. They learned that a wide base and a patient lift in the first courses beat ambition that tried to gain height too quickly. They learned that a subtle batter in a long wall gave strength that a straight face could not. They learned that plumbing a drain with a string before sealing the top saved days of undoing later. Every lesson passed from mouth to ear and from hand to hand. In time, the folk knowledge of brickwork became a civilization's common sense. Bricks carried more than weight, they carried meaning. The moment a mason set the first course of a temple foundation, a priest sealed small offerings into a clay box and buried it beneath the corner. The offerings might include tiny figures of gods or copper tools in miniature, bread-shaped tokens of clay, and a tablet naming the ruler who ordered the work. The brick layers closed over the box, and the wall rose. Later generations who repaired the corner would sometimes find the deposit, read the name, and set a new offering with their own stamp beside the old. In this way, bricks connected time. They were the pages that carried inscriptions from age to age, even when the words on tablets were lost in a fire or scattered by a conqueror. The labor that made the cities was not faceless in its own day. Songs were sung in the yards and stories told in the shade of drying racks. A boy learned how to wipe a mold with the back of his wrist, not the palm, so that he would not leave grit that marred the edge. A girl learned how to carry 2 green bricks without letting them touch, so their corners stayed true. A man learned to read the cloud line and knew when to hurry a course into shelter. The knowledge was democratic and proud. A city that could make its own material did not depend on expeditions to distant quarries or the risky transport of towering beams. It depended on itself, on the daily conversion of earth and water and straw into blocks that grew into rooms, and rooms into neighborhoods, and neighborhoods into a place people loved enough to repair. In the late afternoon, the brickyard quieted as the shadows lengthened, and the rows cast narrow lines upon the ground. The last molds were rinsed. The last loads went out to a site where a wall would begin at dawn. The kiln mouths glowed, and then settled to an orange that signaled even heat. The foreman pressed a thumb into a trial brick and nodded. He would sleep near the fire and wake to feed it in the night. A breeze came up from the river and carried a smell of bitumen and damp earth over the city. Above the lanes rose the parapets and roof lines, all right angles and careful planes, broken by stair towers and by the rising mass of a temple terrace catching the evening light. It was a skyline made by hands over generations, the sum of countless small decisions taken with confidence and with care. If there is a single image that gathers the meaning of Sumerian brickwork, it is a woman on a roof at dusk, smoothing a patch of wall with a wet palm, while a child watches and imitates her motion on a small brick beside her. The gesture is domestic and trivial, and it is also the gesture that kept a whole city from fraying. The Sumerians did not discover a stone that never wears. They discovered a practice that never rested and so never failed. Their cities are gone as living places, yet their bricks still come out of the ground with stamps that name old kings and with edges that show the pressure of a hand, and they say quietly that the first urban people understood how to make a world from what lay under their feet and to keep it standing by showing up each day. Metallurgy. At the edge of where the wind carried the smell of marsh and smoke in equal measure, there was a quarter that woke before dawn and kept its fires alive through the night. The ground there was paved with black, glassy slag that crunched underfoot. Walls were the color of soot. On benches of baked clay lay tools with a dull promise in them. Tongs with jaws shaped like a bird's beak. Hammers with faces, polished by steady work. Crucibles fire-scarred and crusted with a blue-green shine. Here the Sumerians taught earth to bleed metal, and then taught metal to take whatever form a steady hand could imagine. They were the first people on that plain to keep furnaces as a civic trust. They turned raw ore and native nodules of copper into tools and ornaments, into fittings that held wagons together, and into blades that gave a soldier confidence as he stepped into danger. In their yards, the Bronze Age was not a label. It was the glow in a furnace throat and the sound of a hammer making a rhythm that could steady the mind. Copper was the first servant in this craft. Some of it came to Sumer as native lumps washed down in gravel beds that lay far to the north and east. Much more arrived as ore from lands of mountain and stone that the Sumerians knew only by report and by the look of the men who came downriver with cargo. Traders named places with the reverence that farmers reserved for the river gods. There was a land of ore called Magan over the sea, and there were high places to the north where outcrops showed green in the sun and promised metal for those who were willing to break rock and burn wood to make it give up its secret. Sumer had none of that stone. It had reeds and dung for fuel, clay to shape furnaces, and the kind of patient determination that turns lack into advantage. It paid for ore with wool and cloth, with grain and fish oil, and with bitumen skimmed from black pools near the river mouth. Boats moved that economy as surely as barges moved brick. A smelting furnace in Sumer looked modest when cold. It was a short round tower of clay, no higher than a man's chest, lined with a belly of the same material and pierced near the base with small mouths, where clay nozzles called tuyères brought air into the fire. Workers built a charcoal bed and set crushed ore in layers above it. Then more charcoal, then more ore, until the tower held a black sandwich of heat and promise. When the bellows were set to work, the fire turned white at its heart, and the clay gave back the heat with a steady, dull roar. bellows were goatskins or ox hides tied to wooden crosspieces and worked by hand and foot so that they breathed in and out like great animals. The men at the bellows learned to listen for the tone that meant enough air and not too much. Too little and the ore sulked and remained stone. Too much and metal would oxidize and slip away into useless slag. Between those errors lay mastery. The first melts produced a spongy mass, a bloom that looked like scorched bread, full of glassy inclusions. That bloom went to the anvil where hammers drove out the glass and drove the copper together into a coherent ingot that rang when struck. The smith reheated that ingot again and again, each time returning to the hammer to shape it, because copper grows stubborn when it is worked cold. Heat forgives the metal and allows it to bend and stretch. A good smith knew when to stop by the color along the edge and by the feel through the tongs. He knew when a part could be hammered thinner and when it must be left to keep its strength. He knew where a curve would hold and where it would crumple. The craft did not live in his head alone. It lived in the muscles of his forearm and in the callus at the base of his thumb. Sometime in these centuries, a smith or a prospector or a trader noticed that certain ores yielded a copper that behaved differently under the hammer. It took a sharper edge. It kept that edge through more work. It rang with a different tone on the anvil. Those ores carried a guessed metal in small measure, a whiff of arsenic perhaps, or, when luck and trade combined, a little tin. The deliberate mixing of copper with tin became one of the most consequential chemical marriages in human history. Bronze is harder than copper, less easily bent out of shape, and more ready to take a high polish that will slide through tough fibers and resist easy dulling. The first bronzes in Sumer may have been gifts of geology, ore bodies already mixed by chance. Later, bronzes were the result of intention. A master weighed small cakes of imported tin and fed them to the melt at the right moment. He watched the surface for the glint that told him the two metals had joined well. He tested a small casting and judged the sound of it against the anvil. A poor mix was not just a disappointment, it was a danger. A spearhead that bent in the first encounter, or a chisel that deformed in a mason's hand could cost lives or fortunes. Because of that, the trade in tin became a nervous lifeline that stretched from Sumer to lands that lay weeks away at the pace of caravan. Casting brought an artistry that the hammer alone could not reach. The Sumerians made open molds for simple shapes like axe heads and flat blades, carving the form in stone or shaping it in fired clay. They learned to make two-part molds that would join around a wax model and take fine detail. They poured liquid metal by the glow of the furnace while a helper steadied the mold with tongs and another shielded the stream from drafts that could spit and throw. When the metal cooled, the mold was broken or opened and the new object still held the overflow called the sprue. A few quick cuts removed that excess and file strokes finished the edge. The workshop kept bins of offcuts and sprues to go back into the next melt. Nothing that had taken that much effort to extract was wasted lightly. Religious workshops pushed the craft to sculpture. A temple might commission a figure of a god to stand in a niche or a set of ornaments to dress a lyre. In such places, the hammer yielded to the repousse and the chasing tool. Sheets of annealed copper were beaten over wooden forms until a lion head emerged with cheeks and mane and teeth. Then the detail was driven from the front with small punches until the eye looked alive and the mouth seemed to breathe. Inlays of shell and lapis turned the head from fine metalwork into a living image. The famous animals that fronted the lyres of had that vitality because metalworkers understood both material and story. They knew how far they could raise a surface without cracking it, and how much a line must deepen to catch the light in a dim room. Tools made in these yards reached every quarter of the city. A carpenter used adzes with bronze blades to smooth beams that came from far away. A mason tapped with a bronze chisel to dress bricks and to cut sockets for door pivots. A brewer cut reeds with a bronze knife and tied bundles with wire drawn by hand through a hole in a stone. Wire drawing looks like an invention from a later age, but its logic is natural. Soft metal thins if you pull it through a hole smaller than itself. A smith who had learned to draw could make rings and fasteners, could pin wheels to axles more neatly, could lace fittings in a way that wood alone could not manage. The presence of metal changed not simply the edge of tools, but the joints of things, the places where forces meet and must be reconciled. Weapons took a share of the shop's attention. Spearheads with midribs ran true and entered cleanly. Rivet holes took shafts that were wrapped and bound to keep the head from splitting the wood. Dagger blades kept a keen line and wore a polished hollow near the spine, where a careful file had done its work. Helmets of beaten copper appeared on the heads of guards and took a dent instead of a fatal cut. Scales of bronze stitched to a backing made a coat that could turn a glancing blow. These were small protections in an age when courage and numbers and ground still decided most fights, but they mattered. A guard who believed in his gear stood more steadily at a gate. A farmer who received a properly made sickle from the temple store knew that someone with skill had thought of him. The shop did not run on skill alone. It ran on wood, or more often on charcoal, and on the human power that turned hides into breath. Charcoal meant long hours of tending earth-covered piles, where wood burned hot without proper air until the impurities left as smoke and a dense carbon remained behind. Sumer had little wood of its own. That deficit made each sack of charcoal dear and kept smelters honest about how they fed their furnaces. Bellows workers tired and needed to be spelled. Smelting days were planned like military campaigns. Ore was weighed. Charcoal was stacked and covered. Crucibles were dried in a low fire to keep them from bursting when charged with liquid metal. Molds were prepared and inspected. Tools were set where a hand could find them without searching. Then the fire was lit, and the yard became a theater of concentration. Metal gave Sumer something else as well. It gave them a metaphor for change. Clay was plastic and obliging. Brick was modular and loyal. Water could be guided if it was honored. Metal had to be wrestled with and wooed. It existed in stone as a promise that required cleverness to redeem. In myth, this work became a privilege, protected by gods who kept the secrets of fire and earth. In law, it became a regulated craft. Workshops paid in cloth and grain, and sometimes in silver for the right to draw fuel and to keep apprentices. Master smiths swore to the quality of their output. If a blade failed, and the failure was judged to be fraud rather than bad luck, penalties followed. That early accountability is not surprising. When a craft sits near the center of a city's safety and prosperity, it attracts rules like iron attracts a magnet. Those rules kept the reputation of the yards high and kept customers from crowding the door with complaints instead of orders. Archaeology gives us the quiet testimony of this world. Slag heaps do not lie. They show the ratios of metal to waste and tell us whether a furnace ran hot enough and whether the ore was rich. The shapes of tuyères show whether bellows could keep a blast steady. The scars on a crucible lip tell whether a smith poured with a sure hand or spilled and burned his feet for the lesson. The thinness of a beaten vessel tells us how far a master trusted his material and how even his hammer strokes were across a broad surface. A child's copper toy from a burial tells us that the craft could afford a moment of kindness and that families loved their children in the same way everywhere. In the evening, the yard changed character. The big smelting furnace was banked. The small finishing hearth still glowed, while file strokes made a whispering sound and quenches hissed as edges met water. A man wiped oil across a new axe head and set it aside to harden. Another lifted a helmet into a shaft of light and turned it to see whether the curve caught a line cleanly. Apprentices swept and stacked. Someone told a story about a shipment of tin that had been delayed when a caravan leader mistook a dry valley for a pass and had to double back before winter came down. Laughter flickered like sparks. Tired men and boys washed their hands in a basin and marveled for the 1000th time at how the smell of metal never quite leaves the skin. Sumer did not discover iron in any meaningful sense during the height of its cities, and we should not borrow the triumphs of later centuries for them. What they discovered was no less foundational. They learned to pull a metal from stone and make it serve thought. They learned to mix that metal with another and make a new thing that surpassed its parents. They learned to plan for a day when the wind would not be still and the charcoal would be just dry enough and the molds would be cured properly so that an entire shop could move like one body. They learned to sell that work to a city that had learned to ask for it by name and by measure. In so doing, they taught their descendants and their neighbors that matter yields to mind when patience and organization join hands. Mathematics. In a city where canals had to arrive at the right height and rations had to reach the right hands, numbers were not a luxury. They were the quiet agents that made the day run. Along the quays of Uruk and Lagash, under the shade of reed screens, men and women counted jars and baskets while scribes pressed marks into clay that stood for amounts no eye could gauge at a glance. In those courtyards and storerooms, Sumer turned counting into a craft, and the craft into a way of thinking that still orders time and space for us. The Sumerians did not invent numbers. They invented a culture that lived by them. The first thing that strikes a visitor to that world is the elegance of its favorite number. Sumerians built their reckoning on 60. The choice was not mystical. 60 behaves with a generosity that smaller counts do not. It divides without remainder by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. It yields neat halves and thirds and quarters and fifths, which is what a clerk needs when he is measuring oil into jars, or a surveyor needs when he is laying out a field with cords. From this preference flows a cascade of habits that still govern our days. An hour holds 60 minutes. A circle holds 360 degrees. You can watch the mind of Sumer at work on any clock face. That sexagesimal habit did not come out of nothing. Long before there were tablets with columns of numbers, there were fingers with knuckles. A shepherd can count to 12 with one hand by touching each knuckle and the tips with his thumb. 5 times that 12, on the other hand, brings the count to 60. This folk arithmetic seems to have left its print on the Sumerian love for dozens and 60s. The tokens that once sealed tallies inside clay envelopes gave way to marks on tablets, and the marks took on a regularity that mirrored the regularity of a hand. The leap from things to signs was the first victory of an accounting mind. The leap from signs to a place value system was the second. Place value is the discovery that makes arithmetic truly swift. Sumerian scribes did not need a separate sign for every large number. They wrote a sign for 1 and another for 10, and then used their positions to carry the meaning farther. Where a sign fell in a column mattered as much as which sign it was. This system is the ancestor of the way we write tens and hundreds and thousands, and while the Sumerians did not yet have a symbol for 0, they had the discipline that 0 requires. Context held their columns steady. An order for barley made it obvious whether a mark represented 1 or 10 or 60. In time, their successors would introduce a placeholder. The essential step had already been taken by the clerks, who could glance at a tablet and know which line represented a day's ration and which represented a month's. Mathematics in Sumer was first and last an applied art. Surveyors needed to know the area of fields, since water allotments and taxes depended upon it. They measured with ropes and poles and turned irregular shapes into sums of rectangles and triangles. They learned the lengths of diagonals and the way squares relate to their sides. Their work may look simple from a distance, but it required a delicacy of judgment that modern people often overlook. A field that bends around a canal or follows the edge of a mound can be reduced to familiar shapes only by a mind that is comfortable moving between the real and the abstract. The Sumerian surveyor walked with cords and pegs and carried in his head a table of multiplications and reciprocals that would let him turn steps into measures and measures into areas before the light failed. Tables were the instrument that made this possible across a whole city. Clay tablets from schoolrooms preserve neat lines of products and reciprocals that a student copied until the pattern was part of his hand. Multiplication was not built on an endless rote of ones and twos. It was organized around 60s. To divide by hard numbers like 7 or 11, scribes used reciprocals that were ready to be multiplied, a method that made division as simple as a familiar multiplication, followed by a place correction. The best students could run these operations quickly while speaking the steps aloud, just as a master weaver can count threads while her shuttle flies. The result was an office that could calculate grain tallies, convert capacities from one vessel to another, and check construction estimates for ramps and terraces without losing itself in confusion. Time was a third field that Sumerian mathematics made human. To organize a plane that depended on water, people had to know when to open a gate and when to leave a field fallow. The Sumerians watched the moon and learned to bind their months to its phases. They named months for the labors and festivals that marked them. They knew that a lunar year fell short of the great cycle of seasons, and they knew they had to correct for that shortfall if barley sowing was not to drift into heat. Their calendar was a civic tool as much as a sacred rhythm. It told crews when dredging should begin and when embankments should be checked. It told shepherds when lambing would crowd the pastures. It told mill overseers when cloth would be needed in quantity for rations. Behind its simple counts was an astronomer's eye that kept careful watch on new moons and solstices from the roofs of temples. Astronomy in Sumer did not separate itself from mathematics. It confirmed it and drew it forward. Priests and scribes recorded the movements of planets and learned the cycles by which they reappeared in the same patch of sky. Eclipses made a deep impression on a people who measured their world. Records of such events and their intervals strengthened the habit of long counting. The sky gave them a model of regularity toward which they could aim in their own affairs. They did not yet have instruments of glass. They had lines of sight and memory, and a script in which to store what they had seen. The regularity of the heavens was not an abstract comfort. It was a pattern that taught a planner how to hold a schedule steady over years. The way mathematics shaped the law is easy to miss because it is so embedded in procedure. A judge who assessed a fine for a broken levee needed to know the value of a plot that had been drowned. He needed a reliable measure of its dimensions and a rate at which loss would be paid for in barley or in silver. Contracts for land sales and for loans relied on set multipliers and on interest that could be computed without guesswork. When disputes over boundaries arose, the court sent out surveyors with cords to make a fresh measure rather than letting eloquence decide. This is the spirit of mathematics at work, a preference for quantities that can be checked over claims that can be merely asserted. The classroom where all this began was a stern place. Students learned signs, then lists, then numbers, then problems drawn from life. A typical exercise might present a field of a certain length and width and a required yield. How many workers are needed to sow it in 3 days? How much water will it require if the canal stands at a certain height? If a portion is given over to date palms, how should the remainder be measured for barley rows? The answers were not merely arithmetic. They were habits of breaking a problem into parts and then assembling the parts into an action that a foreman could follow. The boy who mastered such questions would one day stand in a storeroom and turn an order from a governor into jars and baskets and seals. He would also be the one a canal inspector asked for when a bend in a levee had to be replotted. Mathematics found its way into the workshops too. A potter who turned a series of jars to the same capacity needed a way to check volume. He learned to use standard measures of water and to adjust the curve by eye to fit what the measure told him. A brickmaker learned to calculate how many molds to fill in a morning for a wall that must stand at a certain height by a certain date. A carpenter learned to set out a true rectangle by checking that the diagonal matched the expected length, a rule that later ages would write on tablets of its own. The quiet exchange between number and craft made Sumer's economy more than a heap of labor. It made it a coordinated effort governed by rulers that could be taught and repeated. There is grandeur in the abstract achievements that later centuries would add to this foundation. Tablets, from long after Sumer's first flowering, reveal a scholar's delight in the properties of right triangles and the ratios that appear in circles and squares. Those texts belong to a later Babylonian stage of the tradition, yet their existence does not diminish the Sumerian accomplishment. It shows instead how powerful the early decision had been to write numbers into clay and to teach children to think with them. What began as a clerk's aid for counting grain matured into a science that could discover formal truths about space and number. The seed was sown in the tablet house of Uruk, when a teacher insisted that a boy copy a multiplication table again until his hand moved faster than his doubt. It is tempting to imagine that such order made life cold or mechanical. The opposite seems true. Numbers permitted fairness, where memory alone would favor the loud and the strong. A ration that is measured and recorded saves quarrels at the gate. A field that is surveyed and marked reduces the chance that two neighbors will hate each other by harvest time. A calendar that is public lets a city prepare for a lean month before it arrives. That is the moral shape of mathematics in Sumer. It was not an idol of precision. It was a servant of peace. At night, on a flat roof where the air moved freely, a scribe might look up from a tablet and rest his eyes on the familiar constellations. He would see the same slow turning that his father and his father's father had seen. He would know within a day or two which star would rise just before dawn next week, and he would make a small note to check the canal levels then. Behind him, his tablet would cool and harden, preserving a table of numbers he had copied that afternoon. In that simple scene, there is a union of head and hand that defined his city. The stars kept their courses. The numbers kept their places. The water would come when the gates were opened as the list prescribed. The world he lived in had been tamed by attention.